Dopamine is one of the most interesting and powerful neurochemicals in the human brain, and it plays a significant role in pretty much everything we do. Learning, motivation, and even movement are all driven by dopamine. But it's often misunderstood. The popular understanding of how dopamine works as a pleasure molecule is actually not true. In this video, we're going to correct some common dopamine myths, discuss dopamine's role in our brain, and teach you how you can use that knowledge to balance your dopamine levels, increase your motivation, and improve the quality of your life. Let's start by covering a few basics. What is dopamine? Dopamine is a neurochemical produced by our brains that performs many functions in our nervous system. There are two general ways that our brains release dopamine. The first is through a baseline dopamine level that is constantly flowing in your system. The second is through peaks or spikes in dopamine. Almost every animal in the world has one form or another of dopamine-driven systems in their brain, because dopamine plays a huge role in how we navigate the world around us. So what does dopamine actually do? Dopamine is often thought of as the pleasure molecule. You eat a piece of chocolate, dopamine goes up, and you feel good. But this isn't really true. Dopamine's role in our brain actually has more to do with motivation than pleasure. The feeling of pleasure we get when we eat a piece of chocolate is not dopamine, but a completely different system in our brain. Dopamine is responsible for your feelings of craving. It's not released when you eat the chocolate, but when you see and decide to go get the chocolate. To understand this, let's look at a study that scientists performed on a group of rats. In this study, scientists removed all the dopamine-producing neurons in the rats' brains. Once the dopamine in their system was gone, the rats in this study lost all motivation to move and seek out rewards. If the scientists fed them cheese, they would eat the cheese and show all the same signs of enjoying the cheese as normal rats would. But if the scientists placed the cheese just 1 inch away, the rats in this experiment would lie there and starve to death rather than move 1 inch to get the cheese. So the scientists found that the rats in this study were still able to enjoy the cheese, but without dopamine, they had zero motivation to get up and go get the cheese. From this study and others, we have learned that dopamine is not actually responsible for pleasure itself, but for motivating us to pursue things that give us pleasure. Let's look at a common example of how substances can affect our dopamine levels. A study by neuroscientists found that chocolate increases dopamine levels by 50%, nicotine increases dopamine levels 150%, cocaine 300%, and amphetamines 1000%. But if dopamine isn't responsible for pleasure, what does this mean? These measures of dopamine aren't about how good these things feel, but about how intensely they make you crave them. While it is true that these substances do cause feelings of pleasure, that pleasure doesn't come from dopamine, but a completely different system in the brain. So in the context of dopamine, these measurements are strictly about how much your brain makes you crave these things. One way we can think about dopamine is kind of like a measuring device for how much we actually want something. The more dopamine an action or substance elicits, the more motivated you will feel to pursue that thing. This is in part because dopamine actually works together with a molecule called glutamate. Among other things, glutamate is responsible for the movement of our muscles. Let's say you have a group of brain neurons responsible for the action of lifting your pinky finger. The way these neurons would communicate with the muscles in your finger is by sending signals using glutamate. If these neurons were to release 10 glutamate molecules, that's a relatively low number. Your pinky might flinch, but you could ignore that signal. Whereas if these neurons were to release 1,000 glutamate molecules, that signal is a lot stronger, and it would cause your pinky finger to shoot up immediately. One interesting thing about dopamine is that dopamine is a neuromodulator, so it actually increases the amount of glutamate released by our neurons. So when dopamine levels are high, and we send signals to our muscles telling them to move, small signals become big signals. When we think about dopamine in the context of motivation, it makes sense that when our craving or motivation goes up, signals involved in movement also get stronger or more intense. This gives us the ability to move and to pursue the things that we crave. So now that we know a little bit about how dopamine works, let's talk for a brief minute about why our brains developed dopamine-driven systems and how these systems affect our daily lives. Every animal and species in the world needs external resources in order to survive and pass on their genes. For the most part, these resources include things like food, water, and reproductive partners. Our brains developed dopamine-driven systems as a way of motivating us to go out and get the things that we need. Millions of years ago, when our brains were evolving, the only things we were really exposed to were things in our natural environment. The problem is, in our modern day, we're exposed to a lot of man-made things that are actually really bad for our health, but that trigger these systems in our brain that determine what's important for our survival. So even though, in your conscious mind, you might know that things like smoking or processed foods are bad for you, your unconscious mind doesn't speak English. It speaks using chemical signals, and addictive substances like nicotine and highly refined sugar chemically activate the part of your brain built for deciding what's important for your survival. It's important to keep in mind that our brains are finely tuned instruments built for surviving in a world that we don't really live in anymore. So it's important to manage and reduce variables in our lives that can throw off the tuning of this instrument. Because just like the tuning of a guitar affects its key, the tuning of your mind will affect your mood, your health, and your life in drastic ways. And ultimately, when our mind is in tune, we tend to feel a lot better. So, how can we find a healthy balance with our dopamine levels? The first step would be to limit overexposure to highly dopaminergic substances and activities. Consistently spiking your dopamine system actually leads to an overall drop in baseline dopamine levels. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. There are two general ways that our brains release dopamine. The first is through our baseline dopamine level. This is like a constant flow of dopamine that's always on in our brain. The second is through peaks or spikes in dopamine, which are like more concentrated releases of dopamine that occur when we see or crave something we really want. Our baseline dopamine level is responsible for our general feeling of motivation in life. People with high baseline dopamine levels usually tend to be more active, excitable, and motivated, and people with lower baseline dopamine levels tend to be more timid, quiet, and less motivated. The way you can think about your baseline dopamine level is kind of like a motivational budget. Let's say that everything you do in your life has a kind of dopamine cost to it. The more motivation it takes, the higher the cost. So if your baseline dopamine levels are high, you generally have more motivation to do the things that you need to do. And if they're low, you generally don't. Consistently spiking your dopamine levels throughout the day actually lowers your overall baseline dopamine level. And the tricky thing about this is it doesn't really matter what you do to spike your dopamine. Running, smoking, doomscrolling, drinking, going to the gym. Even though some of these are more healthy than others, these are all things that can spike our dopamine levels. So even though you might limit some of your less productive habits, if your day is full of other highly dopaminergic activities, the constant stimulation is going to lower your overall baseline dopamine levels and make you feel less motivated in general. Like anything else in life, it's all about balance. You don't have to stop doing everything that releases dopamine, but it can be helpful to limit dopamine exposure throughout your day. There are also some great ways that we can actually increase our baseline dopamine levels. Taking an omega-3 supplement high in EPA has been shown to drastically improve baseline dopamine levels. In addition to this, cold water exposure can actually raise your baseline dopamine levels by almost 100%. So taking a cold shower or bath for 3 minutes before doing work can have a similar effect to drinking a cup of coffee. But one of the most powerful ways that we can raise our baseline dopamine levels is by properly setting our circadian rhythm. To do this, it's important that we go to bed at roughly the same time every night. It's also important to get sunlight in your eyes within the first 30 minutes of waking up. This helps set our internal clock, which can drastically affect our dopamine levels throughout the day. Raising our baseline dopamine level is great, but let's talk about the most fundamental way that you can leverage your dopamine system to make hard work actually feel good. So how can we increase our motivation for the things that matter? It's important to know that our dopamine systems often function through relativity. Let's say that you're scrolling through TikTok and you scroll past the funniest video you've ever seen. You like, comment, and send it to all of your friends. Then you scroll to the next video, and it's still funny, but you don't enjoy it as much. You send it to none of your friends and you don't like it. It's often the case that if you had seen this video first, you would have found it a lot more entertaining. But because you watched the really funny video first, it made this video seem less entertaining by comparison. This model of relative dopamine release plays a huge role in our everyday lives. Let's say you're a musician. When you're at the music studio, it's really easy for you to focus on your music because there's nothing distracting in your immediate environment. But when you're at home, it's a lot harder to focus on your work because your brain knows that there are other, more entertaining things available. So the enjoyment value of your work goes down by comparison. This can make it feel hard or even impossible to get your work done in an environment where too many distractions are available. The way we can solve this problem is by removing these distractions from our immediate environment. Try doing a dopamine detox and getting rid of all highly dopaminergic substances and activities for a month. This will help reset your craving system and make hard work feel more enjoyable. There are two things to keep in mind when doing a dopamine detox. The first is that days 1, 2, and 3 are going to feel terrible. Your brain is going through withdrawals at this time, and your craving for the things that you're detoxing from is going to get really intense. Getting through this phase is the hardest part. After a couple weeks, your baseline dopamine levels will return to normal, and you'll feel just as good as you did before, but you won't need substances or stimulating activities to help regulate your nervous system. The other helpful tip is not to quit cold turkey. Instead of just cutting out dopamine and trying to do hard work, try implementing some alternative, productive habits that can replace your unproductive ones. This makes it easier to get through the withdrawal stage and can help you stick with your detox long term. The first few days will still be hard, but this is a lot better than this. Once you're done with your dopamine detox, you can decide whether or not you want to reintroduce some of your previous habits. Maybe you start playing video games again, but only for an hour a day on Sundays. This helps you re-implement some of the things that you love without letting them hijack your life. So there you have it. Hopefully these strategies can help you increase your motivation and get more out of your workday. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. It's free, and it helps us make the videos that we make. Have a great day, and as always, keep learning.